If you grew up as a woman in an African household, and more specifically within the African diaspora, with maybe also parents who came from a more traditional background in sub Saharan Africa, you probably already knew what your role was as a woman before anyone sat you down and had to explain it to you. This meant that you had to wake up early, you clean up after everyone when you didn't even make the mess, you probably cook, you serve, you take care of your siblings, your father, sometimes even your grandfather. And the men in your house, it doesn't matter if they're older or younger than you, they do not have the same expectations placed on them. They can probably be asleep watching TV or doing something outside and no one literally cares about it or says a word about it. But God forbid, you're the one who's sitting down, you're the one who's resting, expecting things to be done for you because you're a girl. You need to learn how to cook and clean. And not for yourself, by the way. For your husband, a man you haven't even met yet, a man who might not even exist yet, but somehow his comfort is already a problem of yours. You are already being shaped around this non existent human being. And your brothers, oh, nobody's shaping them around anybody. They just get to be a person. And the explanation for all of it every single time is that that's just how it is. It's the culture. Boys will be boys. You need to stay in the house. You don't belong outside. And it's like as if raising your son with zero accountability isn't directly creating the kind of man you're trying to keep your daughter away from. Make that make sense. Now, what if I told you that all of these things that we've heard growing up that we're told is just culture, none of it is actually African? Because a lot of us who have dealt with these frustrations have already figured out how to get away from it. We probably move out, we create some sort of a distance, and then we take the freedom we couldn't have at home and then we run with it. A lot of us grew up in certain homes where if you had pushed back on something, you're probably being disrespectful. And if you questioned anything, it meant a whole conversation you were probably not ready to have. So you kind of just have to leave and then you figure it out on your own. But getting away from something is not the same thing as understanding it. And I think we owe it to ourselves to actually understand it, not just what our parents believe, but where those beliefs came from. Because when you start to see the history, when you see what outside forces actually did to African societies and how much they changed the way people think about women, about family, and what gets called tradition and what doesn't, the things that you grew up with start to make a lot of sense and very different too. It stops feeling like it is something that you have to continue to escape or you just have to accept and endure. And it starts looking like something that was done to your parents too. And I feel like once you realize that, the whole conversation is just changed. See, pain is not culture and suffering is not tradition. And when you go looking for where these ideas actually came from, you do not find some ancient practice stretching back thousands of years. You find something that is actually really recent. It's very messy as well. And I honestly think much darker than most people want to talk about. See, the forces behind what so many African women are living inside their own homes today, they did not originate in Africa. So, on today's episode of They Lied About Africa, we are getting into patriarchy and misogyny in African societies. This means where they came from and what life actually looked like before them. And really quickly, for anyone who needs it, patriarchy is a system where men hold the power at home, in government, in religion, across the board. And misogyny is the set of beliefs that makes that feel normal and natural and overall just unquestionable. It is the idea that women are worth less, serving is their purpose, and that if you say anything about it or stick up for yourself when it comes to it, you're being too difficult. One is essentially the system, and the other is what keeps people from challenging that system. And I want to talk about where both of them originate and come from in Africa specifically, because most people have gotten the story wrong and just say it's culture. And I think it is important to understand this, and it matters when you understand it, but it's not just for yourself, but for what we choose to pass on. So I want to start off by going back, like way back, like before colonialism, before the slave trade or Arab merchants have even crossed the Sahara or any sort of an outside force touched the African continent in any meaningful way. Because if we're going to understand how African women ended up where they are today, we need to understand where they started. And what the history actually tells us is that African women were not always this powerless, not even close. In fact, much of pre-colonial Africa, power didn't work the way that we think of it today. There was not just one person who was at the top of everything and making decisions for everyone below them. And there wasn't even just a single king or some sort of a chief with absolute authority over their subjects. What I found is that in many African societies, power was shared amongst everyone and it was distributed. And Crucially, it was divided between men and women in a way that gave both genuine authority over their own spheres of life. Scholars actually call this a dual sex political system, and this was not the exception. It was actually the norm across much of West Africa. So, what this means in practice is this: there was not just one government, there were two, a male political structure and a female political structure, running in parallel, each with its own leadership. They had their own decision making power and own jurisdictions. See, men handled certain affairs and women handled others. Simple. And neither could fully function without the other. This wasn't just men being generous all of a sudden and then allowing women to have a seat at the table. No, this was how the system was designed, and women's authority was built into the architecture of how these societies operated. Let's take a look at Yoruba societies of what is now southwestern Nigeria. Women held economic power that was unmatched anywhere in the world at that time. Yoruba women dominated the markets. They controlled local and regional trade. They accumulated their own wealth, ran their own businesses, and operated fully as independent economic actors. And the Yoruba political system literally reflected that. The Iyalode, which translates roughly, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, to Mother of the Outside World, was a formal title held by most senior and powerful women in a Yoruba community. She represented what women were interested in the highest levels of governance, and she had a voice in war decisions or when it came to trade policy and basically everything that shaped the life of that community. And it wasn't just a ceremonial role or a one-time thing. They had real power with real economic weight behind it. And it wasn't just the Yoruba, of course. Among the Ashanti of present-day Ghana, the Queen Mother was one of the most powerful figures in the entire kingdom. She was not just a king's mother or maybe his wife. She was a political authority in her own right. And she played a central role in selecting who became king. She could veto candidates. She could challenge decisions. She had her own court, own advisors, and palace. See, the Ashanti system could not function without her. And among the Igbo of southeastern Nigeria, women had their own political assemblies and judicial processes and their own systems for regulating markets and resolving disputes. When British colonial administrators tried to impose taxes on Igbo women in 1929 because they simply could not comprehend that women had economic independence, Igbo women organized one of the most sophisticated and powerful anti-colonial revolts in African history. Tens of thousands of women literally mobilized across hundreds of miles, shut down markets, surrounded colonial buildings, and demanded the removal of colonial chiefs who had been imposed on them. The British called it the Aba Women's Rise. The Igbo called it Ogu Unwanye, the Women's War, because to them it wasn't a riot, it was a war fought by women who knew exactly what they were losing and refused to lose it quietly. And here's something that honestly, when I found out about it, it made me stop in my tracks, and I think it should make you stop in your tracks too. But in pre-colonial Yoruba society, the concept of gender as we understand it today, like this rigid binary of male and female that organizes everything from how you dress to what work you do to how much authority you're allowed to have, that concept did not exist. See, this one scholar that I was looking at in her landmark work, The Invention of Woman, which you can take a look at, she argues that the Yoruba language had no gendered pronouns before colonial contact. No he, no she. It was all about seniority, how old you were, and how long you've been part of a community. And that mattered way more than whether you were a man or a woman. And the entire Western framework of organizing society around gender was quite literally a foreign concept. So when people tell you that the way African women are treated today is just African tradition, that it goes back thousands of years, understand what they're actually saying. They are describing a version of Africa that was largely created after contact with outside forces. The Africa that existed before that contact is far more complicated, diverse, and in many places far more equitable than what came after. So that is the baseline. That is where we're starting from, because what I'm going to talk about next, and there are several layers to what comes next, it only makes sense once you understand what there was before it was taken apart. Now, I got to keep it real with you, because my podcast, They Lied About Africa, has never been about telling you what you want to hear. It's always been about telling you what is actually true, the truth, right? And the truth is that pre-colonial Africa was not a paradise. It was not a utopia of perfect gender equality where every woman was free and every man was treated as his equal. That is a romanticized version of history. And romanticized history is just another form of lying, okay? The reality is that Africa is a continent with 54 countries and thousands of ethnic groups, thousands of distinct cultures and languages and political systems and social structures. And within that enormous diversity, yes, there were societies where women held real power, right? where dual sex systems thrived, where female authority was built into the foundation of how things work. We just talked about that, right? And I just gave you some examples, but there were also societies where patriarchy was already deeply rooted, where women were treated as property and men held near absolute authority over the women in their households. And that was true before any outsider had arrived. Let's talk about the Merina Kingdom in Madagascar, one of the most organized and powerful kingdoms in African history. And in that kingdom, patriarchy was fully built into how things functioned long before any European arrived. Women could not become rulers. Everything was passed through the male line. When a woman married, she became, in a very practical legal sense, part of her husband's family. And if her husband died, she didn't go back to her own family and start over. She was given to another man within that same family. Now, I want to be precise about this because it matters for the argument we're making. That practice, being a widow being taken in by her late husband's male relative, is called levirate marriage, and it existed across many African societies. And in its original context, it was not purely about control. In agrarian societies with no government safety nets, no welfare system, no way for a woman to own land independently, being taken into a male relative's household was sometimes the only thing standing between a widow and destitution. It was a social protection mechanism, a flawed patriarchal one, but a mechanism nonetheless. What it also did, though, was make it structurally impossible for a woman to ever belong to herself. Her security depended entirely on being attached to a man, and a system that makes female survival contingent on male ownership is a patriarchal system regardless of the intentions behind it. And then there were practices that exist across multiple pre-colonial African societies that we have to be willing to name directly. Virginity testing, the practice of inspecting a young woman's body on her wedding night to confirm she had never been with a man. And if she could not prove that, she was returned to her family in disgrace, sometimes even exiled and many times killed, actually, because her value as a human being had been entirely reduced to whether or not a man had touched her before her husband did. That idea of virginity testing and things of that nature, that is not a colonial import. It predates colonialism in several African societies. It's homegrown patriarchy, and pretending otherwise, I don't think helps anybody. Now, in parts of Central Africa, in the kingdoms that covered what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, and Burundi, patrilineal inheritance, the system where property, titles, and lineage passed exclusively through men, was a dominant structure long before European powers arrived, which meant that women, by design, could not accumulate or pass on wealth in the same way that men could. They were cut off from the kind of economic independence that women in Yoruba or Igbo societies had built for themselves. Now, why does this matter? Because the argument that I'm trying to make in this episode is not that Africa was perfect before outsiders ruined everything. That argument, I think personally, is too simple. And if you have a simple argument, it produces nothing but simple solutions. And simple solutions do not fix complex problems, right? The argument this episode is trying to make is more precise than that. I want to note that it is that the patriarchy African women face today is not one thing with only one origin. It is a layered problem built up over centuries from multiple directions, and understanding each layer separately is the only way to actually understand the full picture. So yes, some patriarchy was already there. Some of it was homegrown, and some of it just predates Islam. Some of it predates colonialism. African men are not innocent in this history just because outsiders also played a role. The existence of these external forces does not erase the internal ones. So both can be true at the same time. But here's what is also true. The homegrown patriarchy that existed in pre-colonial Africa, as real and harmful as it was in certain societies, was not universal. It was not continent-wide. It existed alongside societies where women had genuine power, genuine authority, and genuine freedom. There was real diversity with this whole situation. And what the forces that came after did, what Islam in certain forms did, what European colonialism did in a much more aggressive and systematic way, was take that diverse, complicated landscape and flatten it, push it in just one direction. And that direction was not good for women. Which brings us to the second layer, because roughly 1,000 years before European colonizers arrived on African shores, another force was already moving across the continent. Slowly at first, then faster. And it brought with it a whole new set of ideas about what women were supposed to be. Now, before I get into this next layer, okay, I want to be upfront about something. This is the part of the conversation where I feel like a lot of people can get uncomfortable, and I understand that because I am a Muslim woman, and this show has never been about attacking Islam, and this episode is not going in that direction either. What we are doing, though, is looking at history, and looking honestly at history means not giving anything a pass, and this includes religion, including this one. So let's talk about Islam in Africa. not as a, I want to say, personal faith, not as a theology even, but more like a historical force, something that arrived on this continent over 1,000 years ago, moved across it gradually, and as it moved, it changed things, including how societies thought about women. So, Islam came to Africa earlier than most people realize. In 615 CE, just years after the religion was founded, the first Muslims fleeing persecution in Arabia were given protection by the Christian king of Aksum in what is now modern day Ethiopia. From there, the religion traveled north and east, then across the Sahara into West Africa, and by the 11th century, rulers of some of the most powerful empires on the continent had converted. Mansa Musa of Mali, still considered one of the wealthiest human beings who ever lived, he was a devout Muslim. Timbuktu became one of the most significant centers of Islamic worship anywhere in the world. And unlike what happened later in Christianity, Islam in most of West Africa did not arrive through some sort of a conquest. It came through trading and scholarship and gradual contact over generations. Many African societies encountered it and chose it on their own terms. But the thing is, choosing Islam did not mean accepting every single social norm that came packaged with it. And I feel like this is where we need to get specific, because Islam, as it was originally codified, came from a particular cultural context, 7th century Arabia. And that specific context has its own very specific ideas about men and women, about nature such as inheritance, where under Islamic law, a woman receives half of what a man receives, about marriage, where man may take multiple wives, but the reverse is not permitted, about movement in public life, where in certain interpretations, a woman's visibility and participation require male approval. These were not ideas native to West Africa. They traveled in from somewhere else. And when Islam spread it, they traveled with it. Now, this is the part I think most people kind of skip. Not every African society that converted absorbed these norms without friction. The Tuareg people of the Sahara converted to Islam and kept their matrilineal system, which was a lineage passed through their mother's line. Women moved freely and held authority within their communities. They weren't veiled, and when Arab Muslim travelers passed through Tuareg territory, they were genuinely scandalized. They wrote about it in their travel accounts. They could not understand why these Muslim women were living the way that they were. They described Tuareg society as deficient, backwards, because the woman had too much freedom. That reaction alone tells you how wide the gap was between what Islam brought culturally and what was already on the ground in Africa. The Hausa of northern Nigeria went in a very different direction as well, as Islam took deeper root there, especially after the Sokoto Jihad of the early 1800s, which was a religious reform movement pushing for stricter, more orthodox practice. Women's lives changed in ways that are genuinely complicated to summarize. And I want to be honest about that complexity because it is so real. Like some scholars who have studied this period closely argue that Sokoto Jihad actually expanded access to religious education for Hausa women. That literacy and Islamic scholarship became more available to women in certain communities as a result of that reform. That is very true, and yes, it matters. But what is also true is that the same movement spread the practice of seclusion of married women, keeping them in the home away from public life. Women who had been active in markets and community spaces and public roles found that very narrowing. So what the Sokoto Jihad did is not just a simple story of restriction. It gave with one hand and it took with another. It also opened religious and intellectual doors while closing economic and public ones. And for the argument that we're making today about where African women's public authority went, the closing of these economic and public doors is what matters most. There is a real difference between Islam as a living spiritual tradition with deep, genuine roots in West Africa, the Sufi brotherhoods of Senegal, the Timbuktu scholars, the ways millions of West African Muslims have practiced their faith for centuries, and the Arabization of Islam, the process of bundling the cultural habits of the Arabian Peninsula together with the religious teachings and presenting them as the same thing. As if to be a proper Muslim, you had to organize your home and your society the way 7th century Arabian society was organized. As if the Senegalese way of being Muslim was somehow incomplete. As if Touba and Timbuktu were lesser versions of Mecca. Nah, because that process really erased something significant. Before Islam arrived, women across much of West Africa held spiritual authority. They were priestesses, they were oracles, keepers of ritual knowledge. Indigenous African spiritual traditions did not organize the divine exclusivity around male authority. The sacred was not only male, and when Islam arrived in, and later when Christianity came with its colonialism, those roles were delegitimized. The women who held them were told that what they practiced was paganism and primitive, and with that, the entire domain of female authority that had existed for centuries just all of a sudden disappeared. So by the time European colonizers arrived on the continent, West Africa had already been changing for hundreds of years. Islam had reshaped gender norms in some places more than others, and in some communities it opened new frameworks, in others it narrowed things considerably, and in some places it produced something genuinely complicated, a mixture of old and new that looked different from one ethnic group to the next. The landscape was already altered, already carrying marks of centuries of outside contact. And then colonialism came, and what it did was different from anything that had come before it. It wasn't something that was gradual. It was not the result of trade as well, or scholarship, or cultural exchange over generation. It actually happened really, really fast. It was legally enforced, and in several very specific ways, it targeted exactly the spheres of authority that African women still had left. And that is what we're going into next. So now, just a little recap. Everything we talked about so far up until this point. The pre-existing patriarchy in certain kingdoms, the gender norms that traveled in with Islam. All of that existed, and it definitely matters. But none of it compares to what European colonialism did. Not because colonialism invented patriarchy, it did not, but because of what it did to the diversity that had still existed. Because up until colonialism arrived, African societies had enormous variety in how they organized gender and power. Some were deeply patriarchal, yes, but others had those dual sex systems that I mentioned earlier, and female political titles, and those women controlled markets and women-led spiritual traditions. See, there was a range that still existed, and then colonialism came and flattened it. So here's the first thing that colonialism did. When the British administrators arrived in their colonies, they needed a way to govern millions of people with very few personnel. The solution they landed on was called indirect rule. They would govern through existing African leadership structures rather than replacing them entirely. So they find the chiefs, the elders, the male authorities, give them limited power within their communities, use them to enforce colonial policy at the local level. This sounds pragmatic. It was pragmatic, actually. But the way it worked in practice is that colonialism formed a direct alliance with male authority and deliberately excluded women from it. The dual-sex political systems we talked about earlier, where women had their own parallel governance structure, those were simply just not recognized. Colonial administrators had dealt with male chiefs, period. Women's political institutions were invisible to them, and because they were invisible to colonizers, they were slowly starved of legitimacy and resources until they collapsed. And then there is what colonialism did to the law. Before European powers even arrived, African communities governed themselves through living, flexible customary practices, unwritten, adaptable, interpreted differently in different places and different circumstances. When colonizers arrived, they decided that this needed to be codified. It had to be written down and made into formal law that courts could apply. And the people who did the writing were colonial officials and male African chiefs who collaborated with them, not women. Not the Queen Mothers or the Ialodes or anyone who had female authority. The men wrote it down, and what they wrote reflected their interests. See, the 1878 Natal Code in South Africa, one of the earliest attempts to codify African customary law, explicitly stated that the entire system was based on the subjugation of women to men. That was not a description of what African custom actually was in all of its variety. That was a colonial document deciding what African custom would be from that point forward. And because it was written down and made into law, it became fixed and frozen. And what had been living and flexible became all of a sudden just rigid and enforceable. And across roughly 75% of sub-Saharan Africa, versions of that frozen customary law still govern inheritance, land rights, and family life today. Now, in South Africa, under that colonial legal system, Black women were classified as legal minors regardless of their age or marital status. A grown woman had no legal parental rights over her own children, and when a man died, his property did not go to his wife, it went to the nearest male relatives. So that wife got absolutely nothing, and under that system, she had no legal standing to challenge it. Let me make this clear, that was not African tradition. That was a British legal document written in the 19th century, and it governed South African family law well into the democratic era. Then there is what colonialism did to African economies and what that meant for women specifically. See, in Yoruba societies, women's economic independence, their control of the market, and ability to accumulate their own wealth was the foundation of their political power. You cannot understand the Ialodi without understanding that she represented women who had real economic weight behind them. So when the colonial administrators restructured African economies around cash crops and wage labor, this whole restructuring happened almost entirely through men. Men were the ones who were recruited as laborers, and they were given access to colonial credit and resources, and they were taught how to cash crop, farm by colonial agricultural extension programs. Women, on the other hand, who had been the backbone of local economies, were pushed into subsistence farming and domestic labor. Their economic sphere just all of a sudden shrank. And as their economic independence shrank, so did their political leverage. You cannot have an ELOD when the women she represents have been stripped of the market power that made her position meaningful. And colonialism also brought Christianity, right? Which came with its own European Victorian ideas about women, the domestic angel, the modest wife, the woman whose place was in the home. Missionary schools across Africa taught girls domestic science, how to keep a house, how to cook European food, how to be a proper Christian wife. Boys were taught how to read, write, arithmetic. These were essentially just skills that would translate into wages and economic participation. So the curriculum itself encoded a future where men could work in the public world and women would have to manage the household. And that curriculum shaped an entire generation of African families. So when you put all of this together, indirect rule that excluded women from governance, codified customary law written by men to serve patriarchal interests, economic restructuring that destroyed women's financial independence, and Christianity missionary education that trained girls for domesticity, what you get is a systematic, multi-front dismantling of the authority African women still had. And the cruel part is that this literally got labeled as African tradition. The colonial document all of a sudden became culture. The 19th century British interpretation of what African women's role should be became essentially what African people told their children was ancient and sacred and non-negotiable. So that is what we're carrying today, not thousands of years of unbroken African tradition, a layered, relatively recent construction built from multiple directions. And now that we have laid out all of these layers, we could actually talk about what that means for the specific things African women are living with right now. So everything we talked about so far, right? None of it stayed in the past, and it's sitting in your family right now. And it is in these practices that get called culture at your cousin's wedding, and the conversation that you have with your aunt about the kind of wife you need to be. It didn't stay in history. It traveled with time, and it only exacerbated itself. And I want to show you exactly how it traveled, not just tell you that it did. Let's start with bride prices, right? See, in Senegal, research shows that 85% of marriages involved a bride price payment as recently as 2006. In Uganda, a women's rights organization documented men saying out loud without shame, "I am beating my cows," when they hit their wives. Because in their mind, that is what they paid for. Now, bride price as a practice existed before colonialism in many African societies, just like the many other things we talked about earlier. In its original form, though, it was a social transaction between families, a way of formalizing a union and establishing relationships between clans, of honoring the woman's family. It was not some sort of a purchase, but there was a mechanism that changed it. And that mechanism is that when colonialism stripped women of their economic independence and they could no longer own land and accumulate market wealth or hold property in their name, a woman's entire economic existence became dependent on her husband. So she had no independent exit. And when a woman had no independent exit, the bride price that was once a social formality became something much closer to a transaction with enforceable terms. The man paid. He owns. And that logic did not come from the original practice. It came from what colonialism did to the conditions around it. Let's talk about FGM. FGM is still practiced in 29 African countries today: Mali, Guinea, Senegal, Nigeria, Kenya, Ethiopia, Sudan. The list goes on and on. And understanding why it persists requires tracing all three of these layers that we talked about earlier. And according to the scholarly consensus, and this is still debated in certain academic circles, but it is the position most researchers in this field hold. In many of the communities where FGM originated, the practice predates Islam entirely. So in those communities, it started as a rite of passage and a marker of social belonging, of crossing into womanhood, not justifying it, just telling you what I know, right? But the cutting was the ritual. And the point of it was community membership. So now think about the meaning that gets attached to it today, that it controls female sexuality and preserves a woman's purity and modesty. Colonial disruption literally broke communities off from the original context of their own rituals. And severing a community from the living meaning of a practice and then surrounding that community with new frameworks about female purity and male ownership, that doesn't make the practice disappear, and it just reinvents it. And it gets reinvented into the image of whatever power is dominant at that current moment in time. So the FGM that exists today and the practice that existed in those communities before outside contact are not the same thing. They share a name and a physical act. The logic behind them, though, is just very different. Virginity testing is also still happening. If you go to South Africa among Zulu communities, girls as young as 10 are being tested. In Zimbabwe, there are still a few rituals where a fabric is inspected in front of family members after the wedding night to confirm the bride's virginity. In Ghana, the Krobo people practice it as part of coming of age ceremonies. Now, virginity testing in many of these communities does have pre-colonial roots. The idea of female purity as a social value is not something colonialism invented in Africa. But here's what colonialism and certain Islamic interpretations both did to that idea. They stripped away every other source of female value. When a woman can hold a political office and run a market, accumulate wealth, lead a spiritual community, her virginity is one attribute among many. It does not define her. But when you systematically remove every other domain of female authority and independence, and you have no political power or any source of economic independence or spiritual standing or even legal rights, your body becomes the only currency you have left. And everyone around you starts treating it like the most precious thing about you. Virginity testing does not survive because communities are uniquely obsessed with purity, though some may be, okay? But it survives and continues to persist and exist because purity became the only thing left that women were even allowed to have. I also want to talk about widow inheritance, which is something that is still practiced among the Luo of Kenya, the Hihi of Sukuma of Tanzania, the Dinka of South Sudan, Yoruba communities in Nigeria. Like the type of marriage that we talked about earlier in the Marina Kingdom, the original social function of it was not purely about control. In societies without formal safety nets, being taken in by male relatives was sometimes the only economic protection available to a widow at that given moment in time. In that context is really important to understand, and it matters, but here's what colonialism did to that context. When colonial era customary law, that frozen, distorted version written by men in the 19th century or whatever, was codified to say that a woman's land and assets go to his male relative rather than his wife and children, it made that economic dependency permanent and total. So the widow is not choosing the inheritance arrangement out of cultural loyalty. She's choosing it because colonial law made sure she had nothing else. So the tradition persisted and survived because colonialism rebuilt the floor underneath it. And then there's child marriage. Niger has the highest rate in the world. Over 80% of girls are married before the age of 18. If you go to Chad, Guinea, Mali, Nigeria, all above 60%. In northern Nigeria, over half of girls marry before the age of 15. And in Nigeria, there's a colonial legal structure that has never been reformed, where Christian women are legally protected from child marriage and Muslim women are not, under the same law written by British administrators in the 19th century. This is not a type of tradition. It's just a document sitting in a legal archive that nobody has been willing to repeal. And child marriage in the regions where it's most prevalent is being driven by all three of these layers simultaneously. Indigenous practices that tie female value to early marriage and fertility, Islamic jurisprudence and certain conservative interpretations that permits marriage at puberty, and colonial legal structures that encoded these norms into law and then just left. The interaction of all three is why the numbers are what they are, and why reforming any single one of them without addressing the others has never been enough. So what does this all actually tell us? It tells us that the misogyny African women are living with today is not one thing with one cause. Every single practice we just walked through has roots in more than one of the three layers. Islam in certain forms gave the indigenous practices and the colonial ones a religious framing that made them feel divinely ordained and therefore untouchable. And colonialism provided the legal and economic architecture that made all of it stick, that turned flexible living and contested practices into written law and called them eternal African tradition. The reason it is also hard to talk about, the reason why your parents shut down about conversations like this and people call you disrespectful for asking questions, is because the whole thing depends on nobody looking too seriously about where any of it came from. Because if you actually trace it the way that we did, the whole story falls apart. None of it is African. Some of it is. Because the version still exists today, the version being defended as sacred and ancient is a specific construction, built at a specific moment for specific reasons, and it was never inevitable. So here is what I want to leave with you. We started this episode talking about the expectations that are placed upon you as an African girl who probably grew up with traditional parents of the West, right? You're probably waking up early, cleaning up messes that you didn't make, preparing for a man that you haven't even met yet, and then your brother is sleeping. And we trace this image of this individual or this young girl her reality all the way back to centuries of history, kingdoms that already had patriarchy built in, and the arrival of Islam and what it shifted in certain communities through colonialism and the systematic legal and economic dismantling it carried out on African women's authority. We did all of that not to excuse what is happening today, not to say nobody is responsible, but everybody is responsible. Because you cannot fix something you do not understand. And most people walk around defending these practices as ancient African tradition, never ask where any of it actually came from. And here's the thing I keep coming back to. That little girl who's in the kitchen cooking for her whole family. Her parents genuinely believe they are passing down culture. Her mother probably grew up the same way, and her grandmother probably did too. Nobody in that chain of transmission ever sat down and said, I'm going to hurt my daughter in the name of something that was partly invented by a British colonial administrator in 1878. Nobody knows that. That is the whole problem. The lie has been running so long and so deep that the people enforcing it are also its victims. So your parents are not your enemy in this story. They are carrying something that was handed to them the same way it was handed to you, without any source of context or origin, or anyone ever stopping to ask why it's happening. But luckily, we are a generation that can ask why. We have the access to research and the distance that comes from growing up outside the continent, and the education that our grandparents were deliberately denied, by the way, under colonial systems designed to keep certain questions from being asked. And with all of that, we have a choice. We can keep taking our freedom and running and moving out and creating distance and surviving somewhat quietly, or we could actually do something harder, which is understand it well enough to name it, not just to our friends or in the comment sections of TikTok videos, but in the real conversations that we have on a day-to-day basis with the people who raised us, and the way that we raise our own children, and what we refuse to pass down. Because here's what the history actually shows us. Before any of this happened, before the kingdoms that were already patriarchal, before Islam crossing the Sahara, a single European ship landing on a coast, there were African women running markets that entire regional economies depended on. There were African women whose political titles were functional parts of how their governments operated. There were African women who were the spiritual authorities of their communities, the keepers of sacred knowledge, the people that others came to when they needed to understand the world. That is documented. And it existed. And I want to be honest with what I'm saying and what I'm not saying. I am not saying pre-colonial Africa was perfect. We spent a whole segment on the patriarchy that was already there. I am not saying Islam is the problem. I am a Muslim woman, and this show has never been about that. I am not saying everything African women experience today is colonial in its origin. Some of it is genuinely just old and indigenous and contested with African communities themselves. And those internal contests matter and deserve their own episode. What I'm saying is more specific than any of that. I'm saying that the version of African womanhood that gets defended today as ancient and non-negotiable, the one that starts with a little girl in the kitchen being shaped around a husband she hasn't met yet, that specific version has a history and a traceable one. And most of the people enforcing it have never been told what that history actually is. Tradition is not the argument, it is the question. Whose tradition? From when? Written by whom? Enforced through what? And what got destroyed to make room for it? Those are the questions we owe ourselves. Those are the questions we owe every little girl who is going to wake up tomorrow and clean up a mess she didn't make for a man she hasn't met yet.